What is going on, everyone? I am back, and we have officially finished up the first week of football, which means first week of fantasy is also in the book. And there's a lot of news when it comes to fantasy this week. A lot of surprising performances, a lot of injury news to cover. But first and foremost, let's hit one of the main priorities for this entire season, every single week, week in and week out, for all fantasy players, and that is the waiver wire. Because I will give you my top 10 waiver wire pickups for week two, and in no specific order, but let's get right into it. The first guy on my list is Tarik Cohen, the Bears rookie runner, who had a very impressive performance with 5 carries for 66 yards and 8 receptions for 47 yards and a touchdown. Now, a few things with Cohen. He will no doubt be a hot waiver wire pickup for this week, and the reason for that is because he had this performance while being the backup to Jordan Howard, so people think that he will get more opportunities after that kind of performance. And I would agree, but at the same time, I would caution you, this is probably Cohen's ceiling because Howard is still the guy in Chicago, but they will try and see what Cohen has to feel him out, whether he's legit or not, which will mean a little bit of a volume dip for Howard owners. So just keep that in mind. At the same time, he is worth a pickup because if Howard for some reason does get hurt, Cohen becomes the guy to own, pretty similar to Kareem Hunt. So you don't want to miss out on an opportunity like that. But on top of that, breaking down his stat line, those 8 receptions for 47 yards and the touchdown, probably the most impressive considering Bears receivers keep getting hurt. Kevin White just went on IR, and Cohen led the receivers in terms of receptions. So Howard also not the best pass catcher, and you love to have running backs that can be both pass catchers and runners. So for that reason, I would try and get Cohen, especially in PPR league, might be even more valuable there. Moving on, we have Allen Hurns, receiver for the Jaguars, who was one of the guys that benefited from the injuries this week. With Allen Robinson suffering an ACL injury, will be out for the year, which means Hurns now becomes the number one guy in Jacksonville. And I know Jacksonville is going to be a run-heavy team. They proved that this week, but at the same time, they still need some type of vertical threat. And it was only 2 years back when Hurns and Robinson both were studs in Jacksonville, and I think that he can return to that form, especially being the main guy now. He only had 3 receptions for 42 yards, but at that point, the Jacksonville Jaguars were ahead by a lot, so they didn't need to throw it. And I do think they will find themselves in more games where they are down, so they won't be able to just run the ball. They'll have to air it out, and Hurns becomes a very nice target to have. Not owned in a lot of leagues, so go ahead, try and pick him up, especially if you are an Allen Robinson owner. Continuing, we have Javaris Allen of the Ravens, and yet another guy who benefited because of injuries, this time with Danny Woodhead going down with a hamstring issue, same one that he had during the offseason. And his stat line for Allen was 21 carries for 71 yards, actually 2 more carries than Terrence West, but West did have the touchdown. Now, disclaimer for Allen, some of the stat line was inflated because the Ravens were up big and they were going to run on the Bengals no matter what. They didn't have a reason to pass towards the end of the game. And at the same time, if anything, this will probably be a committee choice between West and Allen. But hey, I would go ahead, take a gamble on Allen, see how he does in week 2, and then if you have him on your bench and he has another solid performance, ride with him moving forward. Now, definitely wouldn't prioritize Allen over the guys that I've mentioned before, but a nice little addition. Next, we have Kenny Golladay of the Lions, who was a guy that was getting a lot of hype in the offseason, and wouldn't you know it, he lived up to it. And I was actually surprised, especially against a tough Cardinals secondary, but the Lions had a very nice performance, and Golladay benefited from that. 4 receptions, 69 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Now, this was actually quite the offensive showing for the Lions, and I do think that without those 2 touchdowns, Golladay obviously becomes a lot less impressive. And if you look at that game, it was Golden Tate who dominated in terms of targets, in terms of catches. So he's still the number one guy. I would say Golladay is very much so a touchdown dependent, receiver, but maybe after this performance he becomes even more involved in the offense. I would say definitely try and pick him up though, because some people are very high on him. And worst case scenario, if you don't use him as a flex or something like that, you can go ahead and try and get some trade value for him, because I do think this was more of a kind of ceiling performance, and I don't necessarily think he's going to go ahead and produce this kind of stat line week in and week out. Next guy we have is Alex Smith, and I mentioned his name after the Patriots and Chiefs game. He had 368 yards for 4 touchdowns, 0 interceptions. Now, with Smith, I think he will be a hot waiver wire pickup this week as well. He is a viable backup option in terms of quarterback, and a serviceable one as well if you're maybe waiting until Luck comes back. I will say that Smith is known to have up and down games, not the most consistent guy, but it was impressive, and you have to like the fact that he did have that performance versus the Patriots, who are a decent defense, not some subpar defense like the Saints, for example. So I would say Smith has the weapons around him. He can be successful, and as a fill-in guy, does have value. Possibly his trait bait has value, and can fill in and hold down that quarterback spot if you need him to. Continuing with quarterbacks, next we have Carson Wentz for the Eagles, who finished the game with 307 yards and 2 touchdowns versus the Redskins. And what was impressive for me is that this was a divisional game. Those can tend to be tough, but Wentz put together a very solid performance. And similar to Smith, Wentz can act as a serviceable backup. Look at the matchups, and I think he will be able to take advantage of those. Now, he probably won't be in as high demand as Alex Smith, but a very nice option behind Smith if you cannot land him. Next, a guy that maybe not a lot of people are targeting, Jermaine Curtis, mostly because he is on the Jets. And in terms of a stat line, he had 7 receptions for 59 yards. So mostly for a PPR standpoint, I like Curtis. As soon as he got traded, he became the #1 guy, a little bit better than Robbie Anderson. Now, the Jets will find themselves in situations where they are down big and they will have to air it out. So Curse becomes a nice little option. They won't be running it continuously with Forte and Bilal Powell. Maybe more of a sleeper with Curse, using him as a flex guy and trying to look at the matchups. But if you're very low and hurting in the wide receiver position, I think he'll be an easy guy to pick up this week in waivers and kind of monitor his performances week in and week out. Now here, I'm cheating a little bit. I'm adding 2 guys, Kerwin Williams and Andre Ellington. But the reason is because with the David Johnson news of the dislocated wrist, timeline is somewhere between 8 to 12 weeks. Might be a little bit shorter. We don't really know yet. But hopefully you had handcuffed one of these guys if you had David Johnson. If not, try to add at least one of them, because that's a big blow. Now, what I think is unfortunate even more so is the fact that David Johnson was such a great runner and such a great receiver that neither Kerwin Williams or Andre Ellington alone can fill both of those roles. So I think Williams will probably be the runner. Ellington will be more so the receiver. So in the long scheme of things, I don't think that either of these guys will actually have that big of a performance by themselves. I would mostly add them just for the insurance and just in case one of them does really break out. I will put out a future video about the David Johnson news and what people should do with his status. Now, cheating a little bit again, I've got 2 guys. The first tight end appearances with Austin Hoover and Jesse James. Now, to me, mostly these guys are worth adding because they can be used as trait bait. I would say, especially with tight ends, these big inflated performances are usually flukes. I mean, just look at Austin Hooper. He did most of his damage on just one huge pass play of around 70, 80 yards, and then another big one for 40 yards. And then Jesse James, the only reason he was relevant is because he had 2 touchdowns. But still, I would try and add one of these guys. Worst case scenario, you can use them as trade bait again. And if not, see how they play moving on forward. If you're very desperate at tight end, maybe it'll be something sustained. But I personally would use them more as trade bait coming off of very impressive performances week 1. Now, it wouldn't be a complete video if I didn't mention at least one defense. And I actually have 2 for you. Hopefully at least one is available to be picked up. But first, I like the Cardinals versus the Colts. You saw what the Rams did against Tolzien, and without luck, that offense is in shambles. And whoever is playing them without luck, that should be your target week in and week out defensively. This week it is the Cardinals. And on the flip side, you have the Ravens versus the Browns. I really like what the Steelers did versus the Browns. And on top of that, you saw what the Ravens did versus the Bengals. They blanked them. And I think they'll be able to do similar things versus the Browns. They have a good defense, the Ravens, and the Browns still have the rookie quarterback. So a nice little target with the Ravens. So that concludes my list of waiver wire pickups for week 2. Let me know, did you guys agree? Are there some other guys that you would target additionally? Or maybe some of the guys that I mentioned aren't even available in your leagues? Let me know and give me some feedback. And as always, like, subscribe, and I'll see you guys in future videos.